In the quiet, rolling hills surrounding the small town of Jasper, life in 1894 moved with the steady, reliable rhythm of the seasons. And no one, it seemed, was more in tune with that rhythm than the Benton family. Oswald Benton, his wife, Eleanor, and their two children, young Samuel and little Alara, were the very picture of rural predictability. Their farm, a modest but well-kept homestead about 3 miles out of town, was a testament to their hard work and dedication. They weren't flashy people. They didn't seek the spotlight. Their lives were a simple loop of chores, meals, and rest, dictated by the rising and setting of the sun. It was a life many in Jasper understood and respected. Amos Pritchard, the proprietor of Pritchard's General Store, could practically set his watch by the Bentons. Every other Saturday, like clockwork, their wagon would rumble down the main street. Oswald would handle the heavy lifting, loading up on flour, salt, coffee, and other necessities that couldn't be grown or raised on the farm. Eleanor would often join him, her presence a quiet and gentle counterpoint to her husband's more stoic nature. She'd browse the bolts of fabric or exchange a few pleasantries with the other women in town. Their visits were so regular, so utterly dependable, that to not see them would be like the church bell failing to ring on a Sunday morning. It just didn't happen. The children, Samuel and Alara, were a familiar sight as well. Samuel, a boy of about 10, was often tasked with helping his father, his face a mask of serious concentration as he carried smaller bags to the wagon. Alara, just a wisp of a girl at 7, would cling to her mother's skirts, her wide eyes taking in the sights and sounds of the town. They were known as good, quiet children, polite, well-behaved. They didn't cause a fuss. They didn't run wild through the store. They were just there, a part of the familiar Saturday tapestry of Jasper. Their presence was as expected as the dust motes dancing in the afternoon sunbeams that slanted through Pritchard's front window. This unwavering routine was the foundation upon which the town's perception of the Bentons was built. They were seen as stable, hard-working folk, dependable. They paid their bills on time, they kept to themselves but were always cordial when spoken to. Their lives seemed to follow a script, one of simple, honest living. It was this very predictability, this clockwork existence, that would soon make their sudden deviation from it so jarring, so deeply unsettling. Because on one particular Saturday, the script would change, and after that, the Bentons would never be seen again, leaving behind a void as vast and silent as the prairie sky. It was a Saturday in late September of 1894. The air held the first crisp promise of autumn. The day started like any other Benton Saturday. Their wagon, pulled by their sturdy bay horse, made its familiar journey into Jasper. But this time something was different. Amos Pritchard noticed it right away. Oswald Benton came into the store alone. Eleanor and the children were not with him, which was unusual. Saturdays were a family affair. Their absence was the first small crack in the perfect veneer of the Benton family routine. A detail so minor, yet in hindsight it would loom large. Oswald himself seemed off. Normally a man of few words, today his silence was heavier, more profound. He moved through the store with a strange, distracted air. His eyes, usually focused and direct, seemed to dart around, never settling on one thing for too long. He gathered his usual supplies, but his movements were jerky, almost agitated. Amos, a man who prided himself on knowing his customers, tried to engage him in some friendly conversation. He asked about the farm, about Eleanor and the children, but Oswald's answers were clipped, monosyllabic. "Fine," he'd mutter, his gaze fixed on a distant point over Amos's shoulder. There was a tension in him that Pritchard had never seen before. The most peculiar part of the visit came when Oswald was settling his bill. He pulled out his worn leather wallet, his hands fumbling slightly. As he paid, he mentioned something that struck Amos as odd. He said they were thinking of taking a trip, a long one, maybe out west. He spoke of new opportunities, of a different life. This was startling news. The Bentons were not people who spoke of grand adventures. They were rooted to their land, to their home, The idea of them packing up and leaving seemed preposterous. It was completely out of character. Pritchard didn't know what to make of it. Oswald loaded his supplies, his movements still hurried and tense. He climbed aboard his wagon without the usual parting nod or wave. He just flicked the reins, and the wagon rumbled away, leaving Amos Pritchard standing on the porch of his store with a furrowed brow. The encounter left him with a vague sense of unease, a feeling he couldn't quite shake. He watched the wagon disappear down the dusty road, a small speck shrinking into the vast landscape. It was the last time anyone in Jasper would ever see Oswald Benton, the last confirmed sighting of any member of the family. The clockwork had stopped. 2 weeks passed. 2 Saturdays came and went, and the familiar Benton wagon did not appear in Jasper. At first, no one thought much of it. Perhaps they had all the supplies they needed, perhaps a minor illness kept them at home. The rhythms of farm life could be disrupted for any number of simple reasons. The prairie was a demanding place, and families often had to be self-sufficient for weeks at a time. So the first missed visit was noted, but not with any real alarm. It was just a small, quiet break in the usual pattern. A note slightly out of tune in an otherwise familiar song. But when a third Saturday went by, and then a fourth, a subtle hum of concern began to ripple through the small community. This was different. This was more than a simple disruption. 6 weeks without a single trip to town for a family so dependent on regular supplies was not just unusual, it was unheard of. Amos Pritchard, his mind replaying that strange last encounter with Oswald, began to voice his worries more openly. He spoke to the postmaster, who confirmed no mail had been picked up. He mentioned it to the blacksmith, who hadn't seen Oswald in over a month. The quiet absence of the Bentons was becoming a palpable presence in the town's collective consciousness. The whispers grew louder. Neighbors who lived a mile or so from the Benton homestead realized they hadn't seen smoke rising from the family's chimney in weeks. In a landscape where a column of smoke meant life, warmth, and cooking, its absence was an ominous sign. It spoke of a cold hearth, an empty house. Had they really gone on that trip Oswald mentioned? If so, why wouldn't they have told anyone? Why wouldn't they have arranged for a neighbor to look after their livestock? The questions hung in the autumn air, unanswered and unsettling. The community was small, and its members were connected by a shared sense of responsibility. The silence from the Benton farm was becoming deafening. Finally, the unspoken anxiety coalesced into action. A group of men gathered in Pritchard's store, their faces etched with worry. Among them was Virgil Kemp, a neighboring farmer whose property bordered the Benton land. He was a practical, no-nonsense man. He agreed that enough was enough. Speculation was pointless. Someone needed to go out there and check on them. Someone needed to ride over to the farm and see with their own eyes what was going on. Virgil volunteered to make the trip the next morning. As he left the store, a hush fell over the men. They all hoped he would return with a simple explanation, a story that would put their minds at ease. But deep down, a colder feeling was beginning to take root. The following morning, Virgil Kemp saddled his horse and set out for the Benton farm. The air was cold, and a thin layer of frost clung to the dormant fields. The ride was short, but as he drew closer to the property, a sense of profound stillness settled over him. It was too quiet. There was no barking from the family dog, no clucking of chickens, no lowing of cattle. The silence was absolute, unnatural. It was the kind of silence that makes the hair on your arms stand up. He saw the Benton house, standing stark and silent against the gray sky, and a knot of dread tightened in his stomach. He dismounted and walked toward the house, his boots crunching on the frosted ground. He called out their names. Oswald, Eleanor. His voice seemed to be swallowed by the immense quiet. There was no reply. He knocked on the front door. The sound echoed strangely. He waited, listening. Nothing. He knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. He tried the knob. It was unlocked. With a deep breath, Virgil pushed the door open and stepped inside. The first thing that hit him was the cold. The house was as frigid as the air outside. The hearth was swept clean, with no embers, no ash. It was clear no fire had been lit in a very long time. He moved cautiously through the small home. In the kitchen, a scene of bizarre normalcy awaited him. The table was set for a meal. 4 plates, 4 sets of silverware. A platter of what looked like day-old biscuits sat in the center. A pot of stew, now a solid, congealed mass, rested on the cold stove. It was as if the family had been about to sit down for dinner, and then, in an instant, they had simply vanished into thin air. He saw Eleanor's sewing basket by a chair, a needle still threaded in a piece of mending. It was a home interrupted, a life paused mid-moment. The eerie domesticity of the scene was more frightening than any sign of a struggle would have been. With growing alarm, Virgil backed out of the house and made his way to the barn. The great wooden doors were slightly ajar. Inside, he found the livestock. The chickens were dead in their coop. The 2 cows and the family's horse were skeletal, having clearly starved to death where they stood. The sight was gruesome and heartbreaking. Whatever had happened to the Bentons, it had happened suddenly. It had happened weeks ago. They had left their home, their meal, and their animals, all to perish. Shaken to his core, Virgil Kemp knew this was no simple trip out west. He mounted his horse and rode back to Jasper as fast as he could. He had to get the sheriff. Word of Virgil Kemp's discovery spread through Jasper like a wildfire. Fear and morbid curiosity gripped the town. Sheriff Clarence Dunar, a man more accustomed to dealing with minor disputes and the occasional drunkard, found himself at the center of a genuine mystery. He was a methodical man, deliberate and calm, but even he felt a chill as he listened to Virgil's account. A family gone, a meal left on the table, animals starved in their stalls. It didn't make any sense. He gathered a small posse of men, including Virgil and Amos Pritchard, and they rode out to the Benton farm to begin an official investigation. When they arrived, the scene was just as Virgil had described it, but seeing it through the sheriff's eyes made it all the more chilling. The property was steeped in an eerie silence, a place that felt both abandoned and expectant. Sheriff Dunar began his work methodically, starting with the exterior of the house and the surrounding yard. He instructed his men to walk carefully, to look for any sign of a struggle, any tracks, anything out of the ordinary. They fanned out, their eyes scanning the ground, but they found nothing. No footprints other than Virgil's from the day before. No broken windows, no splintered doors. The lack of evidence was, in itself, deeply unsettling. If the family had been taken by force, surely there would be some sign of a fight. Overturned furniture, broken objects, something. If they had been attacked by outsiders, there would be tracks from other horses, other people. But the ground was undisturbed. The front door had been unlocked, suggesting that either the Bentons left willingly or they knew their visitors. The sheriff ran a hand over his jaw, his mind racing through the possibilities, each one more unlikely than the last. Everything looked normal, and yet everything was profoundly wrong. The men moved from the yard to the outbuildings, confirming the grim fate of the animals in the barn. The sight of the starved livestock cemented a crucial fact in the sheriff's mind. The family had not planned to be gone for long. No farmer, no matter how desperate or hurried, would willingly abandon their animals to such a cruel fate. This wasn't a planned departure. This was an interruption, a sudden, inexplicable stop to the rhythm of their lives. Sheriff Dunar stood in the doorway of the silent barn, the weight of the mystery pressing down on him. The real clues, he suspected, were waiting inside that cold, quiet house. Sheriff Dunar pushed open the door to the Benton house and stepped into the frigid air within. The scene was exactly as Virgil Kemp had described, a domestic tableau frozen in time. The half-eaten meal on the table was the focal point of the mystery. It suggested a sudden, unplanned departure. Why would a family get up and leave in the middle of dinner? The sheriff examined the food. It was simple fare, stew and biscuits. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary about the meal itself. He looked around the room, his gaze sweeping over every detail, searching for something that didn't belong. He and his men moved through the small 2-room house with painstaking care. The main room served as a kitchen, dining area, and living space. In one corner, Eleanor's sewing basket sat beside her rocking chair. A child's worn wooden toy, a small horse, lay on its side on the floor. In the single bedroom, the beds were made. Clothes were folded neatly in a wooden chest at the foot of one bed. A family Bible rested on a small nightstand. There were no signs of a robbery. A small tin box where families often kept their savings was found untouched, containing a modest sum of money. Valuables, such as they were, had been left behind. The absence of a struggle was what troubled Sheriff Dunnar the most. There was no overturned furniture, no broken crockery, no bloodstains. The house was neat, almost unnaturally so. It was as if the four members of the Benton family had simply ceased to exist. One of the men pointed out that the family's heavy winter coats were still hanging on pegs by the door. This was a significant detail. The nights were getting cold. No one would venture far in late autumn without their warmest clothing, especially not with children. It suggested they hadn't gone far, or at least they hadn't intended to. Every detail only deepened the mystery. The house held all the evidence of a family's daily life, but none of the evidence of their departure. It was a paradox. They were everywhere and nowhere at once. The sheriff stood in the middle of the room, turning a slow circle, trying to make sense of the silent clues. The untouched food, the neatly folded clothes, the money left behind, the coats on their pegs. It all pointed to one impossible conclusion. The Bentons had not left. They had vanished. The house itself seemed to be holding its breath, guarding a secret it could not tell. Sheriff Dunnar's methodical search eventually led him to a trapdoor in the corner of the main room, nearly hidden beneath a braided rug. It led down to a small root cellar, a common feature in farmhouses of the era, used for storing potatoes, apples, and other preserves through the winter. With a creak of protest from the old wood, the sheriff and one of his men heaved the heavy door open, revealing a dark, square hole and a steep wooden ladder. A damp, earthy smell wafted up from the darkness below. Taking a lantern, Sheriff Dunnar descended into the chill, his boots thudding softly on each rung. The cellar was small and cramped, the stone walls damp to the touch. Shelves lined one wall, sparsely populated with a few jars of canned vegetables. A pile of potatoes sat in one corner. At first glance, it was just an ordinary cellar, but as the lantern light danced across the dirt floor, the sheriff noticed something. A patch of earth near the far wall looked different. It was darker, more loosely packed than the surrounding ground. It looked as if it had been recently disturbed. His heart began to pound a little faster. This was the first thing he had seen that was truly out of place. He called for a shovel. Carefully, he began to dig into the soft patch of earth. The work was slow in the cramped space. The dirt came away easily. He dug down a foot, then two. He found nothing. No bodies, no buried chest, no clues. It was just dirt. But why had it been disturbed? Why would someone dig a hole in the cellar floor only to fill it back in again? It was a pointless, senseless act that only added another layer of strangeness to the already baffling case. The sheriff stood back, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cellar's chill, staring at the empty hole. But then, one of his men, who had been examining the stone walls, called out. He had found something etched into one of the foundation stones, low to the ground and partially obscured by shadow. The sheriff brought the lantern closer. Scratched crudely into the stone, as if with a nail or a sharp rock, was a single chilling word: Pritchard. The name of the man who ran the general store, the man who had been the last to see Oswald Benton, the man who was at that very moment standing upstairs in the kitchen. A wave of cold dread washed over Sheriff Dunnar. The mystery of the Benton farm had just taken a very dark and personal turn. The discovery of Amos Pritchard's name scratched into the cellar wall sent a shockwave through the investigation. Sheriff Dunnar immediately, though discreetly, questioned the store owner. Pritchard was visibly shaken, his face pale with shock and fear. He swore he had no idea why his name would be there. He recounted his last strange conversation with Oswald Benton, emphasizing Oswald's agitated state and his talk of leaving town. Was the name a clue? A warning? Or was it an accusation? Without the Bentons to explain it, the single word was a maddening dead end, a signpost pointing in a direction no one could decipher. The investigation expanded. Sheriff Dunar organized search parties that combed the fields, woods, and creeks for miles around the Benton property. They searched for days, their calls echoing through the empty landscape. They were looking for anything, a piece of torn clothing, a discarded item, a makeshift grave. But they found nothing. It was as if the family of four had been lifted from the earth, leaving not so much as a footprint behind. The vast, indifferent prairie seemed to have swallowed them whole. The scale of the search was immense, but the results were zero. Back at the farmhouse, Sheriff Dunar went over the evidence again and again, trying to piece together a coherent narrative. The clues were a collection of bizarre contradictions. The unlocked door and untouched valuables argued against a robbery. The half-eaten meal and abandoned animals argued against a planned departure. The lack of any signs of violence argued against a struggle. And then there was Oswald's strange behavior in town, his talk of a trip west, which seemed to conflict with all the evidence at the farm suggesting they had gone nowhere at all. Every theory the sheriff developed crumbled under the weight of these contradictions. If they had left willingly, why leave the meal, the money, and the coats? If they were taken by force, where was the evidence? The name in the cellar was the most tantalizing and frustrating clue of all. It connected the silent, empty farmhouse to the world of the living, to a specific person. But it provided no context, no explanation. Was Oswald trying to tell them something about Pritchard? Or had someone else carved it there to frame him? The questions piled up, each one more unanswerable than the last, leaving the sheriff and the entire town of Jasper adrift in a sea of uncertainty. Weeks turned into months, and the seasons changed. The snows of winter blanketed the Benton farm, covering the silent house and the empty fields. The official investigation, having exhausted every lead and every possibility, eventually wound down. Sheriff Clarence Dunar was forced to file the case away, unsolved. The Benton family, Oswald, Eleanor, Samuel, and Alara, were legally declared dead, though no bodies were ever found. Their farm was eventually sold, the house emptied of its ghostly contents, but the story refused to fade. It became a permanent part of the local folklore. The disappearance left an indelible scar on the community of Jasper. The comfortable predictability of their world had been shattered. Neighbors looked at each other with a new, subtle flicker of suspicion. The silence of the prairie no longer seemed peaceful. It seemed watchful, capable of holding dark secrets. Amos Pritchard lived out the rest of his days under a cloud of unspoken suspicion. Though never charged with any crime, the name scratched into that cellar wall followed him like a shadow. The mystery of what happened to the Bentons became a cautionary tale, a ghost story whispered to children on dark nights. Over the years, the story became legend. Theories abounded, growing more fantastical with each telling. Some said the family had finally made their trip west, starting a new life under a new name. Others whispered of a more sinister end, that they had met with foul play at the hands of someone they knew. There were even wilder tales of a pact gone wrong, or of something ancient and otherworldly that lived on the prairie and had simply claimed them. But they were all just stories, attempts to fill the terrifying void left by a complete lack of answers. Today, more than a century later, the fate of the Benton family remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of the American frontier. The facts are as stark and as puzzling as they were in 1894. A family vanished from their home in the middle of a meal, leaving everything behind. No bodies, no ransom, no motive, no answers. All that remains is the unsettling image of a table set for four, a cold pot of stew, and a name scratched into a cellar wall. A silent, enduring testament to the day a family simply disappeared, leaving behind nothing but a question mark that hangs over the land to this very day.